Hello, I'm Lori Weaver, a student in the TRU Masters in Education program. I've been taking Theories in Counseling as an elective during my program. My motivation for taking this course was not to become a professional counselor, but to gain additional knowledge and skills that could be incorporated into my practice as an educator. In the past, I've done quite a bit of counseling in my military career related to conduct and performance of subordinates. I've also had mentoring, coaching, and teaching roles. As a future educator, I will continue to fill these roles of counseling, mentoring, coaching, and teaching, and the different perspectives I've gained through this course has given me new ways to approach these roles, as well as some specific techniques. In this presentation, I'm going to discuss the knowledge journey that I followed throughout this course and what resonated with me that I'd like to take with me into the future. I want to start by talking about some of the things that resonated with me from each of the theories, including some of the key points, roots, and key figures from each of the theories. We started with psychoanalytic therapy, created by Freud and further developed by Erikson, Jung, Kernberg, Konet, and Mahler. Freud used many of his own reflections of childhood experience, as well as experiences working with clients to develop the theory. I did not identify with the core beliefs of this theory that all behavior is driven by unconscious forces and that we need to spend a lot of time analyzing the unconscious. I think in certain instances where there's been suppressed trauma, this may be more applicable, but for the type of work that I would like to do, the core principles of analytic therapy did not resonate with me. However, parts of this therapy that resonated with me were theories that discussed development and some of our defense mechanisms. So not really the underlying principles of this therapy, but more the academic contributions that they made about development and one way that we can view people's responses, which I think are very valuable in an educational context when you're dealing with children and adolescents. I think this provides a good framework to help us situate the client or students' development, particularly Erikson's developmental stages, which talk a bit about what people in those development stages may be grappling with. The ego defense mechanisms provide good descriptions that highlight some compensation mechanisms that people might be using. Next, we learned about Adlerian therapy, which does take some things from psychoanalytic therapy, such as the approach to life that starts from ages 0 to 6, and that it's important to make the unconscious hidden goals conscious. Developed by Adler and further evolved by Carlson and Bitter, Adler focuses on the person as a whole with beliefs, goals, values, interests, motivations, their own interpretations of their past, and the world as a whole. Adler recognizes that they are situated in a specific culture and environment with social factors and relational factors that influence who the person is and how they act, think, and feel. At its core, Adler feels that it is important to view the client how they view themselves. The whole person view is echoed through many of the subsequent theories, and it resonates with me. Additionally, Adler felt that people had three main things to do in life: build friendships, establish intimacy, and contribute to society, and that they realized these goals through their lifestyle map, which included how they perceived the world, their actions, thoughts, and feelings. From my perspective, this is a very true and holistic way to view a person and their life. In terms of techniques or procedures, Adler, like many after him, placed importance on first establishing the relationship between the client and the therapist. I think giving this its own face highlights the importance of it. Corey states that the importance of the therapeutic alliance is a well-established critical component of effective therapy. Next, Adler has an assessing phase, although I do not feel that formal assessment should be emphasized in an educational setting, as I feel it focuses on problems and labels. Using tools with a client to better understand them as a person is a good way to start working together. Adler uses how people talk about early recollections and what specifically they remember to help him understand their viewpoint. He also works to discover their strengths, which places the emphasis on the positive rather than negative things, which I think is important in an educational setting. He also examines mistakes in the logic of their thinking, which is important to understand and is later emphasized in cognitive behavior therapy. Additionally, he uses homework to help transfer learning in therapy to the client's life, and encouragement when the client is trying new things to help motivate them to keep going when they have setbacks or challenges. We then view existential therapy, which was developed by Frankl, May, Yahom, and Bogatel. This therapy rejects psychoanalytic therapy principles, but it does use the underlying principles from Adlerian therapy, such as the whole person view. At the core of this therapy were a lot of things that resonated with me, some more strongly than others. The concepts of freedom and responsibility, desire to gain an identity and form relationships, and self-determination, those parts of the conditions of humanity are again echoed in other therapeutic approaches, but really resonate with me. Seeing the individual as constantly evolving and changing based on their experiences is also important, and it gives us the optimism that we as people can change. Equally important, this viewpoint gives teachers, therapists, parents, and even friends of someone struggling the optimism that by being a part of the person's life and environment, we can have a positive effect on how they develop and change as a person. Some of the other conditions of humanity I would likely only delve into deeply if the situation warranted it. For example, I would not likely talk about death unless the client's problem related to death, either of a loved one or their own health. Existential therapy avoids using specific techniques and just focuses on what insight needs to be achieved, how the client sees their world and themselves, understanding their values, and how they can live their values. We did see in psychoanalytic therapy's developmental stages the understanding that identity and role is a key developmental stage in adolescence. They state from age 12 to 18. So this type of self-exploration and understanding could align well with this development stage generally, and could be incorporated into curriculum related to writing, art, and self-expression. Next, we explored person-centered therapy, which was developed by Carl Rogers. Person-centered therapy has strong roots in existential therapy, sharing with it the phenomenological viewpoint, as well as the importance of freedom, choice, values, responsibility, autonomy, and finding purpose and meaning. The client-therapist relationship, which was important in existential therapy, becomes central to person-centered therapy. At the center of person-centered therapy is the therapist-client relationship, ensuring that the therapist's communication is accurate, empathetic, and understanding, providing unconditional positive regard, and ensuring the therapist is genuine. This relationship is the main contribution of person-centered therapy and forms the basis for the therapist-client relationship in many other therapies, although I agree with most other approaches that this relationship is necessary, but not sufficient to promote change in most cases. This approach generally does not use specific techniques. However, one branch of the approach is person-centered expressive arts therapy. Allowing children to express themselves through art, music, and drama is something that is already used in school curriculum. So teachers are already using this as a way for students to express themselves and their feelings. The next therapy that we talked about was Gestalt therapy, which was originally developed by Fritz Perls and further developed by Laura Perls and Irving and Miriam Polster. This therapy took the phenomenological view from Adlerian therapy and the idea that people are always evolving from existential therapy. Perls used Jacob Moreno's empty chair technique. Fritz Perls' original confrontational style and showmanship aimed at frustrating and manipulating the client held little appeal for me. However, many of the core underlying concepts are similar to those that we have already seen, and they do resonate with me, such as the I-thou relationship between the counselor and the client, regarding the client phenomenologically, grounding the sessions in self-awareness, choice, and responsibility, and regarding the client as a whole person, inclusive of their environment. Some new themes emerge as well, such as focusing on the present, making the therapy experiential, and using nonverbal cues that the client displays. Although the nonverbal cues are used in a very specific way in this theory, which I do not identify with, Being aware of nonverbal cues is an important part of listening and understanding the client. I also see similarities between resistance to contact in this theory and ego defense mechanisms from psychoanalytic therapy. These concepts provide additional conceptual grounding to help understand clients' thinking and actions. Although Gestalt therapy has both experiments and exercises as techniques, I would not feel comfortable applying very many of these in an educational setting. The use of experiments would require significant additional training, and the exercises are quite overt and specific. The exception being goal setting, which I think is a very good way for the client to frame what they want to achieve and have a focus point to achieving it. Next, we view choice theory and reality therapy. Taking the emphasis on free will and choice from existential therapy, as well as William Power's control theory, this therapy also rejects the Freudian model of unconscious control. Given times in my background when I counseled young adults on performance and disciplinary issues, this theory as a whole, which was developed by Glasser and Wobelding, resonated the most with me. Grounded in the belief that people make the best choices that they can see, it aligns with person-centered therapy's compassionate approach, although it adds an educational role for the therapist, where the therapist is teaching the client how to self-evaluate. This does not negate the phenomenological view, as the therapist is not telling the client what they see. It involves teaching the client to better see themselves. This theory also supports gently challenging the client, which aligns with encouraging the client to recognize incongruencies between their choices and desires. Once again, we see an emphasis on responsibility and a focus on the present. We also start to talk about plans made by the client. This is the first theory that we really see empowerment and action present. This therapy also de-emphasizes diagnosis, which for clients that I will be working with in an educational setting is, I think, a positive. A lot of stigma is associated with mental illness, and being diagnosed as mentally ill in some cases gives the impression that the client is restricted in what they can do as they are mentally ill. Although in the educational system, diagnosis is sometimes required to ensure that resources are assigned to help an individual and necessary accommodations are made, I don't think that including the diagnosis in the therapist-client relationship or the teacher-student relationship is helpful. The techniques used in reality therapy are, I think, the most applicable to educators dealing with students with behavioral or performance issues. Similar to Adlerian therapy, this technique first involves establishing the relationship between the therapist and client or teacher and student. In this case, the relationship is meant to be supportive and challenging, which is what a teacher-student relationship should already be. Then the WDEP model is used to talk about the wants, needs, and perception, what the student is currently doing, have them evaluate if what they're doing is working for them, and then have them come up with a plan to improve the situation. Reality therapy uses a goal model that is similar to SMART goals called SAMIC model. I would just use SMART goals with students as the acronym is easier to remember and it's more commonly used, but the principles are very similar. Behavior therapy, which was developed in waves by Skinner, Walters, Bandura, Lazarus, Kabat-Zinn, Hayes, and Linham, was examined next. It draws on a lot of other therapies, the person-centered therapy relationship, the existential therapy when it comes to responsibility, Gestalt therapy's focus on the present, and Adlerian therapy's premise that the client and therapist should work together to form goals. As Skinner has significant influence in education, I was already familiar with the core of his theory, which is that antecedents and consequences together cause behavior. This relationship is easy to see in punishment and reinforcement with children. However, when someone is establishing the reinforcement or punishment, the external nature means that the behavioral solutions are not always successful in changing long-term behavior, especially when reinforcement or punishment ceases. However, within the behavior therapy approach, it is the client that works with the therapist to set goals, so they have control to continue reinforcing the positive behavior in themselves. In this theory, the portions that I identified with is the goal setting, action focus, focus on the present rather than the past, the way the therapist tailors their approach to each client, and the scientific approach of monitoring whether doing a certain thing is working. Many of these concepts align with those already discussed through, although the emphasis on the scientific approach of monitoring is something more present in this theory. The techniques I would want to focus on are things that can help all children, like progressive muscle relaxation, mindfulness techniques, and goal setting. In some situations, social skills training might also be appropriate and useful, such as when anger management is an issue. The next theory we examined had so many branches that it was difficult to fit it all on one slide, so I'm going to talk about each branch separately. In general, though, cognitive behavior therapy takes many of its core principles from behavior therapy, such as the focus on the present, the desire to target specific problems, and the therapist-client relationship, which is Adlerian or person-centered. Albert Ellis, who developed the rational emotive behavior therapy, focused on irrational beliefs being the center of negative emotions and behavior. This therapeutic approach focuses on teaching the client how to detect and discriminate and debate irrational beliefs, and then replace them with a more effective philosophy, with the goal of developing acceptance for self, others, and life. One of the reasons that this theory is strong is because it is easy for people to identify with. I think we've all experienced negative self-talk, or a way of thinking about ourselves, our actions, or others in our life that's not really rooted in truth, but in some irrational belief. Especially when working with young people who also have issues with self-confidence, this approach can be very strong. It also includes the therapist taking a teaching role, but also still aligns with the therapist maintaining positive regard, a genuine response, and empathy. I think that this approach could be used situationally when it was recognized that an irrational belief might underpin some of the students' less helpful behavior, so less as a theoretical basis and more as an approach applied situationally. A number of techniques are described relating to the rational emotive behavior therapy. Those that I can see using in a classroom environment are relaxation, modeling, focus on changing language, and of course homework. The next branch of cognitive behavior therapy was developed by Aaron and Judith Beck and is simply known as cognitive therapy. It was initially developed to help those with depression using an evidence-based approach, but this approach was later used to develop approaches to other disorders like social anxiety disorder, post-traumatic stress disorder. Cognitive therapy identified that self-criticism, pessimism, and hopelessness were present in cases of depression, and that the therapist acted as a catalyst and guide to enable the client in self-discovery and introspection. Another branch that grew out of this was Christine Pedesky's strength-based cognitive behavior therapy, which theorizes that the client can use what they're currently doing well and situations where they currently deal well with their challenges as their personal model of resilience. This can then be used and applied by the clients in situations that they are currently challenged in their responses, basically looking at things that they do well and figuring out how they can apply these successes in other parts of their lives. Again, I identify with the focus on evidence-based practice, as I think it promotes a climate where the therapist tries to identify what would be best for the client based on what has worked with other clients. From an academic perspective, I think that the negative cognitive triad and the ways that psychological distress can be caused by catastrophizing, selective abstraction, overgeneralization, labeling or mislabeling, personalization or magnification or minimization fit well in understanding clients. Capitalizing on strengths and determining how they can be applied to other areas of a person's life is a strong approach in any context and aligns with the optimistic outlook that people can change, and seeing better choices will help enable this. In terms of techniques, we see homework come up again and creation of an action plan which relates to goal setting. The last branch of cognitive behavior therapy is cognitive behavior modification, which was created by Donald Meichenbaum. Similar to the other CBT approaches, it centers around examining self-talk and inner dialogue, but also uses how we relate stories of our past to examine these. In an educational setting, examining how we write and tell stories could be a powerful way of teaching self-observation that could align well with curriculum goals. Different versions of the same story could be examined and reflected upon to determine whether the people in the stories are empowered. Students could be asked to talk about beliefs the characters may hold and how else they could have viewed the problems they are having. The way different news outlets portray the same story could be examined. They could write their own story before and after studying these things. The other really strong thing about this therapy is the relapse prevention that's built in. Following up with clients is similar to retesting a topic in school. Larson-Sundquist states, testing memory has a reinforcing effect on memory, and it improves retention more than an equal amount of repeated study. This is known as the test effect, and has been demonstrated throughout numerous studies. Use of the test effect can be aligned with follow-up to support relapse prevention in an educational setting. From the perspective of techniques, we once again see relaxation training and homework. Additionally, CBM advocates teaching problem-solving skills to empower the client or student to solve their own problems. This is already a strategy used in education, so it fits in well. Following the exploration of cognitive behavior therapy, we learn about feminist therapy. This therapy was developed through contributions from Jean Baker Miller, Carol Zerb-Ennis, Olivia M. Espin, and Laura S. Brown. They built on the social equality and social interest found in Adlerian therapy, the therapeutic relationship found in person-centered therapy, and the idea that the therapist and client are on a shared journey as in existential therapy. It centers around the notion that different identities help shape how we see ourselves, including influence of society. However, as individuals, we need to define who we are and advocate for social change if we're being devalued or oppressed. Although my personal experiences have reinforced the belief that within Canada, we are in a society where oppression is not currently a frequent occurrence, and people are willing to advocate for themselves if they feel that circumstances are unfair. Policies within the military supported this view. The same is true in an educational setting. Policies support equity. Although I'm not sure how often people need to be encouraged to advocate for themselves due to oppression in our current social and political climate, advocating for oneself is an important skill to have, regardless of the reason that you need to advocate. At its core, most of the principles resonate with me, and many are similar to those found in other theories. People exist in a political and social context, and it is important to recognize and understand that. It is very important to value everyone's voice and way of knowing or being, and in doing so, I think you're ensuring a good climate within a school or a classroom. Once again, the egalitarian relationship of therapist and client are stressed, which aligns with the previous therapist-client relationships discussed. This theory also focuses on strengths rather than diagnosing, which I feel is important and empowering. I think in education, it's especially important to value diversity, which is also producing a positive climate. Additionally, this theory has the client setting goals and making their own decisions, which aligns with the empowering goal setting found in other theories, such as reality therapy. The specific technique that I think would be powerful in an educational setting is reframing and relabeling to change how the child sees problem causes and how they see themselves. The final therapy that we mind mapped was family systems therapy, which also has several branches: open forum family counseling developed by Adler and further Dekers, multi-generational family therapy developed by Bowen, and human validation process model developed by Sater. These therapeutic approaches all focus on understanding the individual within their family and determining how the family can support the individual in their therapy. From my point of view, listening to family perspectives and stories and focusing on the emotion and communication that's found in the family are important in understanding the context that the child's in. Listening to these stories aligns well with cognitive behavior theory's use of a narrative approach. How do families talk about one another? How does the child talk about family members? In an educational context, it's very helpful to have the parents' support and involvement in any change initiatives, providing them with the knowledge and tools to best assist their child. This is supported by a number of studies as referenced by Deslandis and Bertrand and Ewan. In terms of techniques, family systems therapy, like many of the other therapies we've seen, stresses the importance of initially forming relationships with the client and their family. Because the therapy is focused on a group, one important step is to ensure that there's a shared understanding of discussions. This hasn't been mentioned in the other therapeutic approaches, but it's important in any group activity to ensure that everyone has the same understanding. Finally, the therapeutic approach focuses on creating plans and tasks, which aligns with goal setting that we have previously discussed. The final therapeutic approach that we studied, postmodern therapeutic approaches, we did not complete a mind map for. However, some of the things mentioned did resonate with me. Setting small goals and celebrating small gains is something that I've used in the past while counseling, as well as using it with myself. I think it's good to look at things that are currently going well and try to exploit what is working from these opportunities. Not only is that a positive way to look at things, but that way the client can actually envision what it feels like to succeed, because they've already done so in other circumstances. I also strongly believe that there is no right solution to specific problems that can be applied to all people. I'll probably take this further than the theory says and say that no theory should be applied to all people and all situations. Finally, I value feedback as a proven motivational technique and also as a way to help the client or student focus on specific issues. Providing an outside perspective or to get the client's feedback on how something is working. Although I haven't explicitly noted feedback as something found in other theories, it is actually embedded in many of the techniques in some form. With respect to techniques, the one that stood out for me was the letter writing technique. Bajori, McGann, and Newland show how letters can be used to highlight a specific accomplishment or act as a counterstory to reframe experiences more positively. In an educational setting, I think this technique could be used as a motivational technique and to get a student to think more deeply about a particular thing. Letters could be a special way to give feedback to students. Students could also be encouraged to share their letters with their parents as a way of engaging their family in learning. Now that we've looked at the therapies individually, we're going to look at my own personal integration perspective, starting with the relationship to the client. So after looking at the theories that we covered and what resonates with me, there are many common factors. As the common factors approach is described by Corey as the integrative approach with the most empirical support, and it aligns with how I'm viewing the theories, I will develop my personal integrative approach using the common factors that resonated with me. With respect to the relationship between the client and therapist, many of the theories saw it necessary for the relationship to follow the person-centered model, where the therapist must be genuine, communicate accurately, empathetically, and in an understanding way, and they must also express unconditional positive regard or encouragement. Most therapies also say the counseling experience is a shared journey, where the client and the therapist are both engaging together to determine what the current state was and set goals for change. In several of the therapies, the therapist also acts as a teacher, providing the client with skills to help themselves. At the core of my own approach is this positive, supportive, but gently challenging relationship. When we first look at the view of human nature, many common principles resonated with me. First of all, that we must view the person as a whole, taking into account their beliefs, goals, perceptions, feelings, interests, and understanding that they live in a societal, cultural, and relational context. This holistic view is pervasive in many of the therapeutic approaches. Additionally, the concepts that we're self-aware and have the freedom and responsibility to make choices in our lives. Those choices are often driven by needs, and people make the best choices that they can see. Additionally, the optimistic concept that people are always changing and evolving is present in many therapies, and relates to the ability for people to make changes in their lives. Finally, underlying this viewpoint of human nature is the principle that the individual is the one that can best see and understand themselves, and that when trying to understand human nature in individuals, we need to take a phenomenological approach. Next, there were a number of things that I identified with more from a knowledge perspective and less from the perspective that it should be a theoretical basis. I have included these as I feel they relate to the evidence-based practice, which is identified as a common element in many of the theoretical approaches. I feel that as a therapist or teacher, one should incorporate any type of new information that is grounded in study into our practice that will help us better understand, identify with, and treat a client, or help a student. Things like reasons for resistance to contact, the ways in which normal information processing can be exaggerated to cause distress, the negative cognitive triad, the presence of irrational beliefs, and developmental phases are all pieces of knowledge that can be used to better understand a person or a situation. This knowledge bucket should be added to continuously as we learn more about people, how they function, and how they can be understood. With respect to the therapeutic approach, there are a number of common approaches that I would incorporate into my own approach. Certainly using an evidence-based and scientific approach resonates with my own science and engineering background, and it's common among a number of the therapies. Also common to a number of the therapies is the focus on the present and current problems, as well as seeking out some of the client's strengths rather than diagnosing them with an illness. At the heart of this is asking the client if what they are doing is bringing them closer to where they want to go. Although I would not use the DSM-5 to give an assessment, part of an action-based or experiential approach is the act of the client trying out new things and self-monitoring their improvement. This also ties into the feedback for the therapist and therapeutic approaches in general. Also resonating with me is ensuring that the client knows that they are valued as a person, their particular voice and ways of knowing, which is part of valuing diversity and culture while still not supporting marginalization. In any therapeutic engagement involving families, hearing their perspectives and stories is also very important. The final things that resonated with me relate more to techniques or procedures than they do to an approach, core knowledge, view of human nature, or relationships to clients, so I will approach them as such. When we talk about techniques, a number of therapeutic approaches do not prescribe techniques, and the therapist is encouraged to use whatever techniques work in that particular instance. With the basis that I've already discussed, I will talk about what situations I might use different therapeutic techniques that resonated with me. First, I want to consider techniques that I would use to help students build resilience and reduce stress. Mindfulness techniques and relaxation training were mentioned in a number of different therapies. All of these could be taught to a class and then reinforced individually as applicable. Also, the idea of discovering your strengths and figuring out how to apply them to other situations is powerful and a positive way to help people make changes themselves. Building this type of model could also be aligned with other curriculum outcomes and be completed as part of class. Using art to allow children to express feelings is something that's already done in schools, and it would be good to continue using it as a stress-reducing, resilience-building tool. Another technique that came up in multiple theories was the use of goal setting, problem solving, or self-evaluation and action plans. Reality therapy provides an excellent procedure leading to change, which included a self-reflection phase looking at wants, needs, and perception, and then examining what you're currently doing, self-evaluating behavior and wants, and then developing an action plan. This model can be repeated to align it with the behavior therapy methods, which stresses self-monitoring as part of the cycle. It can be incorporated into follow-up as well. Teaching students this cycle of goal setting is an excellent way to allow them to address many challenges that they're having. However, as discussed, rather than teaching the SAMIC model for goal setting, I would teach the SMART model, which has been shown to be effective in classroom settings, as described by Lawler and Hornack. Another technique that did appear through multiple theories was looking at self-talk and language, both in how we speak to others and in how we see and speak to ourselves. Although it is the focus of Meechenbaum's cognitive behavior modification therapy, other therapies stress self-reflection, such as existential therapy, or examination of how we perceive our memories and speak to ourselves, like Adlerian therapy. With feminist therapy, we see reframing and relabeling as a technique to change the perception of problem causes or of individuals themselves. Additionally, within family systems therapy, Sater stresses communication and sharing our best selves. This again comes back to the importance of language choice, internal logic, and dialogue. As previously discussed, use of narrative techniques could easily be aligned with curriculum to increase students' awareness of their internal dialogue, the importance of how they choose to speak, and changing the way that something is explained can drastically alter how it is perceived. The last techniques are general techniques to deal with class or student behavior, but could also be applied to other techniques discussed. Most therapeutic approaches discuss the importance of forming a relationship before anything else. Many also discuss modeling behavior or language that is beneficial, teaching new skills, and practice through the use of homework or role play. Follow-up is important in all situations, both in terms of feedback as well as increasing the longevity of skills. Encouragement from the teacher is also critical to the student's development, and the technique of letter writing can be used to provide encouragement or emphasize an improvement. All of these come together to form my integrated approach based on common factors. I hope you've enjoyed my presentation. Thank you very much.